you were exploring the characteristics and the ideal traits that you'd be looking for in those that could pass and be drawn into selection to come out the other end as the candidates that we want to be the elite of the elite within the armed forces. And I know you won't be able to distill it down into bullet points, but the conversations we've had in the past, the overarching theme has been that there isn't an ideal candidate, but there are ideal lessons that need to be learned to get a person in the right place to be in the mindset that they need to be to approach selection. And if that makes sense to you, I'm just going to open up the floor for you to develop that a little bit, because it's kind of reaching into conversations we've had in the past as a terribly worded question, but a bit of an angle for you to broaden on.
Yeah. So what is it that we're looking for? Is that the question?
In theory, yeah.
Yeah. So it's a fantastic question, and it's incredibly complicated. In a nutshell, if I could distill it down, and I will, I would say people that are prepared to navigate uncertainty. So me joining the Marines, and again, this is my story, and it's my origin story, if you like, and it's useful for people to understand themselves. But as a volunteer for Marines, I had no idea what I was letting myself in for. I was prepared to navigate whatever challenges were thrown my way. When I went on to selection, I had not spoken to anybody that had passed. I'd only ever spoken to people that had failed. So I had some idea, but that was massively skewed by their, rightly so, sort of tail between their legs, stories of absolute impossibility of passing the course. So it was a pretty warped view of what the selection process was like. And I knew, again, maybe not consciously, but I knew subconsciously I just had to go and find out myself. I was never going to get the answers that I needed and whether I was what they were looking for. So I myself was prepared to go into the unknown. And again, for context, I think it's important. When I did that, that was beginning of 2003, back end of 2002, and a long time ago now. And there wasn't an awareness of anything to do with what they did. It was so much more this level of secrecy. Now, I guess some people would be saying, well, in part because of people like me talking a little bit more about it. I mean, I only ever share the kind of personal, the kind of human aspect to it, never really the detail of the organizations. But there is a lot more known about the organizations. The internet has it's out there. There is data out there. There's information you can, at the touch of a button or the type of a keypad, you can find out anything you want nowadays within some level of detail. And so, I didn't grow up having that access. We had the Children's Britannica, Book of Britannica, that was our resource for getting information. I sound like a real old knob, but there was a lot of information that we didn't have access to, and we had no way. Nowadays it's different. And so people, and again, I'm the same. If I want to know something, I just Google it. But navigating that uncertainty, going towards something where you don't know what the answers are, you've got no idea, I think that's really important. So that's absolutely a key thing that we're looking for with individuals, that a willingness to go into something that's unknown, but they trust in themselves that they'll not give up and they'll not stop until somebody else says that's enough, or it's time to switch focus and do something else now. And that's quite important. Now, I feel really lucky with me learning all this and kind of doing an awful lot of thinking. I'm fascinated by this, Fergus. I've got an interest in psychology. I've always been fascinated by it, and so I've always looked through my career through the lens of a bit of psychology, and so I've always been thinking about these things in a little bit more detail. And I was really lucky towards the end of my career, probably about 4 years before the end, to be invited out to Wharton Business School to go and visit something called the Mission Critical Team Institute. What on earth is that? Well, Wharton Business School is the world's most successful business school on the basis of what their graduates earn when they leave. Again, that's a separate story to one of measure success, but that's how they measure it. It's viewed as number one in the world. And their Mission Critical Team Institute is a program that's led by a great guy called Professor Preston Klein, and doctor now, actually, Professor Klein, Preston Klein. And he he runs this mission critical team institute, where mission critical team is defined as groups of teams of people that within 300 seconds or less have problems thrown at them that if they don't solve them, there's catastrophic issues on the back of that. So like loss of life or huge problems. So organizations like NASA, organizations like Special Forces, organizations like the FBI, organizations like CIA, all these organizations, really, SEAL Team 6 were there, the Delta were there, all these awesome organizations were there. And little old me was invited out to kind of give my 5 pence worth as well, and to understand what exactly the question that you've asked, who is it we're looking for? Is it different? And how do we extrapolate that from people that have volunteered, basically? And there's a ton of things, but some of the common themes within all that is this people's willingness to walk towards the problem. That is an unusual thing for people to want to do, more unusual than not. That a terrific car crash, most people will watch. Most people won't walk towards the problem. Some people will, and absolutely some people. And that kind of sheepdog mentality, that kind of almost the servant mentality to other people, is one part of that. Other things that we see, the ability to manage stress. Like stress is going to come at us whether we like it or not. Some people can manage it well. They can take themselves to high levels, but get themselves back down, to be able to find people that can regulate themselves, that know themselves well enough to know how to do that. We don't have the time, these organizations, to teach people all of these skills over time. So we've got a brief amount of time to select for them. So certainly that resilience is another thing that these people have in abundance, where they are going to get knocked down. They are going to be faced with incredibly impossible challenges that they can just go at, bite off as big a chunk as they can, learn they've not got the skills to do what they need to do, to maybe go seek more other people's advice or learn more about themselves, to prepare themselves better, and then to come back and reattack the problem again. This resilience is one of those things that we just see time and time again. So there's a ton of things that actually these people have, but there's some common themes. I think one of the things that sums it up best for me is that sheepdog mentality, almost viewing yourself in kind of a servant role, but almost a protector, a guardian, almost. That's a common thing. Whether you're in NASA, and what drives people to go to space? I mean, really, we know there's not a lot out there, but it's this belief that, well, actually, one day we may need to get this human race off to a different planet, because we could all be hit by an asteroid, I guess. I know this is some astronauts' motivating factors, and that's a servant mentality. You're not doing it for us; you're doing it for the greater good of the human race. And again, that intrinsic motivation to do things for a greater good is another kind of common theme.
What moment of your military career rewired your current mindset the most?
Oh, that's an interesting. That is a very good question. I will tell you one that stands out as an epiphany moment, which I've shared before, and I think has got a tangible takeaway from it. And that is, brief background, I was Royal Marines, and then I went on selection for Special Forces. So selection process, 6 months. It's the same SBS, SAS. It's the same selection process. Everyone knows about the kind of, walking around Wales with a heavy weight on your back. And there's lessons within that we can dig into afterwards. But after that phase, you have 2 weeks where you essentially do some work on the ranges to get familiar with the weapons you're going to be using, the rifles, and then you deploy to the jungle. On that 2 week phase in between, on one of those range exercises, what you're predominantly doing is what we call break contact drills. So scenario is you're a small patrol, and as you're patrolling, enemy contacts you, ambushes you, and you have to extract out of that position using kind of cover and maneuver. Good example, watch the film Heat. It's probably got one of the best scenes in that for it. So during that, I was firing my weapon rifle down range, and I turned my head to shout to a guy across from me to tell him to move. And as I did, as I turned my head, I squeezed off a round. So although my weapon was pointing down range and technically it's safe, that's still a safety violation because my eye was not through the rifle sight. And you can get 2 of those violations on selection and then you're off. So that was basically my 1 life gone. And you kind of go and you to the head instructor and he just gives you the, you've had this warning, so you're officially notified. And as I was leaving his office and I was walking back over to the accommodation, I was kind of going over this in my head. And I realized in that moment that I'd been putting so much pressure on myself to be perfect and sort of concentrating on the end result of passing or failing that I was actually performing worse. That mistake that I'd made, I'd never made that in my entire career beforehand. But it was almost this pressure I'd taken myself past optimum performance to it having a detrimental effect. And I realized that I just needed to let go of that because I had no control. Obsessing over the end result was not helping me. And actually, all I needed to do was concentrate on each day or each moment and just be the best I could, put all my effort into that, and the result would take care of itself. At the end of it, I was either going to be good enough or not. And I just let go of that pressure. And it was almost like a physical weight lifting. And from that point onwards, the experience was a much more positive one. It was more, I say enjoyable loosely, like obviously not a very enjoyable experience selection, but also it made it much more likely to get the result that I wanted, which was to pass. And that was the result I ended up with. So that releasing of that pressure to be perfect made a huge difference. And it's something that I see a lot with the coaching that we do. We see one of the most common sort of behavior cycles that we see, what we call boom and bust. And that is someone decides they want to make a change. So a pain point gets acute enough that they want to change something. Health and fitness is the classic one, losing weight or getting fitter. And so they decide, right, that's it. I'm going to get this perfect training plan or this perfect diet. And in 8 weeks, I'm going to weigh this much, or I'm going to be able to run this fast, whatever it is. And they follow that plan perfectly for a week, maybe 2 weeks. And then they get a last minute deadline from work, or their kid gets sick or whatever it is. And they miss a meal or they miss a training session. And so the next time that they're due to take an action, that thought process creeps in of, you've already spoiled the perfect run. So that means you're not going to get that perfect result. So what's the point? And so you then miss the next one and the next one. And you basically just throw it all out the window. You fall into an all or nothing mindset. You bin the whole thing and you're back at square one. And people just live in these boom bust cycles of trying to make these big perfect changes and they're rebounding back to where they are. As opposed to the ethos that we embed with everyone we work with is something we call moving average. And the moving average is the idea that you do not need perfection to make progress. All you need is consistency. Like everyone has bad days. Everyone misses workouts and training sessions. But if you switch from that all or nothing mindset to, okay, I can't do an hour workout, but I can do a 15-minute walk. Well, that still ties into my moving average. And all you need is your moving average to just be in the positive, just always edging into the positive. And if you do that and get rid of this timeline obsession as well and see it as a lifestyle change and becoming that type of person, as opposed to just getting an end result, it's game changing. When people make that shift, the results they get are so much easier to achieve. And ironically, they get them far quicker as well.
Something I've heard you talk about before, and interestingly I spoke about with Mike Chadwick last week, ex-paratrooper, and it's the external validation that we all need as human beings from when we're doing things that we're A, proud of, or B, find difficult, and not receiving the feedback that we want or crave, and then that stopping us from moving forwards, even if the thing is something we're passionate about. So I know in the jungle, as part of SF selection, you don't get much feedback at all, if any, from the DS, do you? And that often breaks a lot of the applicants because they aren't sure where they are in the pecking order. And as with selection, you don't really know how you're getting on because it's not if you're in the first 50, you'll be fine. It's where are you with the pack? What's the parameters are always moving, aren't they? So it means that people are in the dark and need to keep moving forwards without knowing that they're doing a good job. And I think that feeds into why habits can seem not very sexy to people because there's nobody giving you a pat on the back for ignoring your phone for the last 60 minutes. It's kind of you versus you in that sense, and you need to try and implement these things over time so that you're just constantly moving forward. So how did you respond to not having that validation from the directing staff? And do you have any other examples of guys you were with or anything you witnessed that didn't allow them to continue, where the external validation was what they really needed to be able to actually move forwards?
This directly ties back again to process and your ideal self. And this is the change we see all the people on our course. As they go through it, they get much better at, just when you really love the process, you like the result does become less and less important, but also your ability to self-validate becomes much easier, and that is so powerful when you're not looking for that external feedback. So with the jungle, you're absolutely right. You basically hardly get any feedback, and the jungle is such a hard environment to soldier in that you make mistakes all the time, and the DS is just there and they're making notes to their pad. I'll give you an example. Our patrol, like everything is just hard work, and we were filling up our water before we had to go and meet our DS. We were doing a patrol Navex or something that day. And we were in a bit of a rush anyway to make the timing, and all of the patrol were over the other side. There was a river and a big like fallen tree with some rope across it to get across the other side. And 6 of the patrol were over that side, and myself and one other were getting the water, and it's down on this like kind of muddy bank. We're filling up the water bottles, and then we were like coming back up the bank, and I slipped a bit, and I only found this out afterwards, but one of the other guys in the patrol said to me, I was like, Jeff's having a bad day, isn't he? Because I just slipped. He's like, it'll probably fall off the bridge next. Oh, sure enough, what happened? So I was going across this log bridge and slipped, and I grabbed the rope, and I fell, and I was like, because you've got a massive burden on your back, so that weight, and I was literally, imagine at 90 degrees, like perpendicular to the log, just holding onto the rope. And I was like, well, fucking hell, I've just got to let go. There's nothing else I can do. So I let go, dropped like 5 feet, luckily onto the bank, not the river. But then, like, my weapon was covered in mud. I was covered in mud. So then got back up, got over, raced. We got there, got to the DS. What's the first thing he says? Right, strip your weapons, show them to me, because they're expected to be clean all the time. And there's nothing you can do. You just have to like hand your weapon over covered in mud. And so things like that kind of happen all the time. And if you let that get into your head, if I'd let that get into my head and be like, oh, you failed, because that's obviously a big black mark. But because I was I'd had that moment before where I'd taken the pressure off, but B, this was all I wanted to do. There was no way I was going to come off that course unless I was taken off or medically taken off. Like, no, I was going to stay there to the end.
How would you have
do
felt
my best each day?
If you'd handed your weapon over covered in mud and he said, "That's you, done. You're off home, mate." How would you have felt? Would you have been happy with the effort you'd put in and accepted the mistake was the mistake, or would you have been wrestling with yourself that you could have done things differently?
I would, up until that point, well, I mean, it's got it so long ago now, like, obviously you'd be massively disappointed. Like, for me, I just would have put myself straight back on. So especially with the tools now, it's quite hard retrospectively to think about it, but you have to, hindsight, is a wonderful tool, and we can always think, did we do this or did we do that? And it's good to identify the mistakes, but you have to, and this is something you do in the military, you have to look at that time, did you make the best decisions you could have with the information you had, or take the actions that you had? And it kind of comes in, so I'll answer your question in a bit of a roundabout way, because it was something I was going to come on to. So when I finished the jungle, you don't know if you've passed until you go back to Hereford. So you've got a few days like decompression stuff, and then you fly back, and then you're told. But when you actually finish, because you're under the canopy, under the trees for 4 weeks, like pretty much tactical the whole time, and then you get a helicopter back out to the army battle camp out there where you're kind of staying until you leave. And they hand you a beer when the index is called and you're on that helicopter. And I remember sitting on that helicopter flying over the canopy, and that was that was more satisfying than even passing, like getting my berry and stuff at the end, because in that moment, even though I didn't know if I'd passed, I knew that I'd done all that I could. And so whatever the result was, I was like, I couldn't have done any more. And that like moment of self kind of validation, that meant more to me. I was like, you're like, you did it, because it is. You can't explain the trees to people. Like the point in Brecon marching around with the weight on your back, that's not selection. That's just to get your plane ticket. Like, it is difficult. It's boring and it's shit, and it is physically taxing to a degree. But it's not like, if you find that hard, then good luck in the jungle, because it's really not. Like, the jungle is just a whole other level of physical and mental hardship where you're just on the edge of what you're capable of every single day. Like, it just really tests you. And so for me, getting through that and getting to the end of it, I was like, you did good there. It was a good effort. And that kind of self-satisfaction. And I think it is somewhat personality driven, as in, ever since I was a kid, like, I never needed or expected my parents or anyone to come to a football match, or I just never needed. I was always, I think I naturally had that to a degree of, I know when I've put in the effort, and if I'm happy with that, fine. I don't need anyone else to tell me what that is. That's up for me to define. And it is powerful. It does take a huge amount of distress off. Like, it obviously is nice to get that validation from other people, but the more you can move towards your own metrics of defining, which only comes from knowing who you really are and who you want to be and how you want to live and your values and your own integrity, when you act in line with that, it just makes life a lot easier, as opposed to always looking for someone to externally validate what you're capable of.
So the deep thinking and exposure to essentially that period of time meant that you had the confidence to give selection a go. Talk us through the decision-making decision-making process required to be able to, in yourself, you've referenced being the best version of yourself many times rather than competing against anyone else. And that is in what in many ways is required. A good friend of mine, Gaz Banford, who was former Sergeant Major of the SBS and SAS recruitment for many years, he said something that really reframed my perception of selection for Special Forces applicants, which was, they don't turn up as the finished article. They just come with the malleability to be able to be made into one. And I think the key question for you from me would be, what was the moment that you decided, you know what, I'm ready to give this a go, and you found that confidence within yourself?
Well, none of the above. I had been, when I joined the parachute regiment, I was in the 2nd Battalion. My mother died of cancer when she was 38, and I was 19 years old. And she divorced Jeffrey Horsfall, so the army became my home. My parents, I was technically a military orphan. And when she was dying, I was transferred from 2 para to a special unit called the Vigilant Platoon, which was anti-tank guided missiles, which were the wild bunch of the parachute regiment. And I was very, very happy there. And we got attached to 1 para to do a tour of Northern Ireland, the South Armagh one. And during that tour, the Milan missile came in, and our special unit was going to be disbanded because it was a much higher grade of anti-tank guided missile, and it was going to go to the anti-tank platoons. So they said, you can go back to wherever you want to. And I said, right, well, I'll go back to the 2nd Battalion, the parachute regiment. They said, okay. And then they changed their mind. Well, if you tell somebody that you say yes to somebody and you change your mind, you're a bit of an arsehole. If you say no to somebody and change your mind, you're always going to be a hero. So advice to people, if you're not sure of the answer, always say no, you can change your mind. But they changed their mind and they said, well, no, you're going to stay 1 para in a rifle company. Well, I've been in 2 para mortars. I've been in a vigilant platoon. I was coming up to 21. And so I should have had rank, but I didn't because I'd been in 2 senior companies. And so I was behind on the rank process, and they were going to put me back into a rifle company in 1 para. And I said, well, I'm not going to have that. They said, you'll do as you're told. Well, I said, I know there's something you can't stop me doing. And I went up to the battalion clerk's office and put in my papers to go to the SAS, just to put cock a snooter to authority. And there was a Yorkshireman at the back called Bosley. And he said, I don't know why you're doing that, Horsfall. He said, you'll be back with your tail between your legs, you wanker. You're far too young. And off I went in summer 78. I failed at the first attempt, but they kept me on, and I passed the selection that began in January 79, and never looked back for the next 6 years. So
how did you cope with the first round as a failure? Obviously, as a huge learning lesson, but given that you were younger, probably within the cohort of applicants, you had been used to, I mean, you turned up at 14, you told join next year, and from that point onwards, it was quite a binary process. Obviously, you've got all the reflections now to be able to say that it was character building and developing your resilience at the time, but how did you deal with it emotionally and pragmatically to bounce back to nail it the second time?
Well, I wasn't fit enough, and I wasn't mentally strong enough to pass the first time. I knew that straight away. I got to day 4 of test week, which is sketch map, and I was struggling across a long open expanse of tussock grass in the pouring rain. There was nobody in sight at all. I knew how far I had to go. I kept falling over. I had 50 pounds on my back, kept falling over, getting up, falling over and getting up. And there was nobody to help me get up. My back was bleeding. I had 2 massive ulcers from the weights pushing on the kidney areas of my back. And finally, I just turned around and went back to the previous checkpoint and voluntarily withdrew. And I didn't blame anything but myself. I wasn't ready. I wasn't good enough. And when I went into the office the next morning to say goodbye and get my kit ready, the officer in charge, Jerry Hopkins, said, we think you've got the potential. Would you like to stay here for the next 4 months and try to start again in January? And I was like, well, at least I won't have to go back to Bosley and and eat humble pie.
So plan A was actually successful in many ways.
Now there's photographs of me on the first selection, and there's a photograph of me 4 months later at the beginning of the second, and I'd had 4 months to prepare. I would go down the swimming pool at 6 o'clock in the morning in Hereford, do 1,000 meters in the pool, go back, have some breakfast, do an 8-mile run, then start work. And if I wasn't working during the day, I wasn't required for anything. I'd be up the mountains walking some of the routes. And the photograph of me in the second one, it looks like a totally different individual. I look 4 years older. I've got a thicker neck. I've got healthier looking skin. I look strong. I look like an athlete. Whereas, although I was a parachute regiment soldier, I was a little bit chubby in the face, and I certainly wasn't the same person with it. So I had time to prepare, and I had time to prepare with the people that were doing it and with the people that knew what to do. And so the second time round, 57 of us started the selection and 8 of us passed. And that was the winter of 79, which was one of the coldest winters on record. And we had 1 person die on test week. But a lot of people think that SAS selection is like that fitness business of running over the mountains and carrying heavy weights. But that's just the first month. And then you've got continuation training. You go off to the jungle. You live in the jungle for another month, and you work and you carry even bigger weights, and you get eaten alive by everything that's in the jungle, everything that's little. And then you come back from there with having lost a lot of weight, and you do a combat survival instructor's course. And then if you're not already a paratrooper, you do your basic parachuting course. And then if you're okay, you join your squadron, you get your cap badge, but you're on probation for 6 months, and you have to learn a personal skill and a troop skill. My personal skill was to become one of Britain's early paramedics, and my troop skill was in mountain climbing, mountain troop. And at the end of exactly 12 months at the end of 12 months from the day you started, you're then qualified as a SAS soldier, and you're reassessed 2 years later. Not to do the whole course, just to, do we want to keep him? And I did 2 tours. After 6 years, I got stitched up for something I hadn't done, and decided to take control and purchase my discharge. One of the things I've always, looking back, is if things aren't going the way I want them to, and I've done my absolute best, and the barriers are too big, I've tried to go round them, tried to go over them, tried to go under them, tried to achieve higher standards, then I'll change direction and I'll take control rather than keep banging my head against the wall. So that's another piece of advice if anybody wants it.
No, it feeds into a lot of what we've said already, which is, I mean, it's in many ways the same example as if my son wanted to be a hairdresser, he better be a bloody good one and give it his all, because it's find the direction that suits you best and then go at it with everything that you've got. And that's essentially what, in many ways, what selection is. I've often heard hills referred to as the ticket to the jungle, which is where selection actually begins, but the rigmarole that follows even getting through that is, I can imagine, draining. But it's fantastic to hear that the humility that came with voluntarily withdrawing, and then seeing that as an opportunity, not letting your ego get in the way, not letting your pride get in the way, and using the 4 months as essentially leverage to go again, but harder, which, against the context of some of the discussion we've had before, could have easily been you saying, oh, well, I gave selection a go, don't you know? By the way, I gave it a try. I was so close if it wasn't for this or this or this, which is an excuse in many ways. You owned what you were missing, you filled the gaps, you went back again, and you succeeded, which is a very binary, very simple way of looking at any problem to overcome on a day-to-day basis, albeit the stakes were a little bit higher once you actually got out. And you passed in March 1979, and in 1980, you were part of a rather significant military operation, Operation Nimrod, which was the Iranian Embassy. Talk us through the decision to commit to it and how the experience unfolded.
Yeah, so I 1986, I decided that enough was enough really for our growth, and being being a keen map reader, and I class myself as being quite a good map reader. So for me, SES selection is they do 2 a year, one in the winter and one in the summer. And for me, because of the Falklands, the cold weather and that lot, and the Norway side of it, the obvious choice really is to do a winter course, because again, the mentality is you can, if you're cold, you can always warm yourself up by running a bit quicker. Whereas if you're really hot, it's quite difficult to cool down, if that makes sense. So I did a winter course, and bizarrely, I was doing really well on it on the initial, and the first bit of selection. People assume running up and down hills is actually the hardest part of selection, but it isn't. It isn't. It's just a means of actually trying to get an individual who is self motivated. And what happened was in 1986 winter, they had the worst weather conditions in memory, to the extent that they actually cancelled test week, which is really unusual and quite bizarre. So test week of the first bit of selection, the first 4 weeks, is a series of route marches over a 6-day period. They get longer, kilometre wise, miles wise, and your backpacks get heavier, if that makes sense. And obviously finishing with actually quite a long endurance, they call it the endurance route, which is actually quite a long thing. Normally takes about 20 hours to complete. So on the second route of the 6 days that we were doing, was out on a place called Elam Valley, and unfortunately the weather hadn't improved at all. So having cancelled that week, they then decided, listen, weather's not improved at all. We're just going to go for it. And on the second route that we did, I was unfortunate enough to be called off the vehicle first, which meant that I was going to be trailblazing, if that makes sense. And bear in mind that the snow was up to your crutch. So with the weight and stuff, and so off I went, and young lad, determined, blah 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 blah. Got 3/4 of the way round, and the chief instructor was at a checkpoint that I got to, and he advised me to step off. He said, "Listen, just step to one side, get yourself a nice cup of tea, and allow 2 other people to overtake me, and then trailblaze, and then just get into there." their footsteps, if that makes sense. So make life easy for yourself. I totally ignored the advice, as you do. Yeah, I'm fine. So carried on, and all I remember is going up to the final checkpoint, because this is going to be the final checkpoint. And then I woke up in a helicopter, and it was a really bizarre sort of feeling, to be one minute on the ground, running around like a lunatic, to waking up in a helicopter. And what had happened was I got to the final checkpoint, took my Bergen off, and this was actually told to me by the instructor, and he said, "Yeah, what I did was I gave you the next grid reference, which was down to the finish point, and literally it was all downhill." And he said, "You acknowledged it. You then put my Bergen on." So the instructor's Bergen was on the side of him. I put his Bergen on my back, and then ran in exactly the opposite direction to what he said to go. So he sort of tackled me, got me sorted out, and next thing I'm in a helicopter, and I think it was just pure exhaustion, cold, and everything. I was just it all sort of came upon you. So when I was in the sick bay that night, because I'd done really well, I hadn't had any warnings or gypsies warnings, as they call it. Because you're allowed one gypsies warning. If you're slightly under the time that they give you, you're allowed one warning. I ain't had any of them, and I thought, this is my gypsies warning. But the training major came in and said, "Listen, we've spoken to the doctor. They're recommending that you don't continue." And it's the worst feeling I've ever felt, even worse than not being picked for Lincoln City, if that makes sense. My world just shattered, because all I ever wanted to do was pass this selection. So it was, yeah, very, very dark period, for the 2 days that I was recuperating, watching all the guys continue doing the selection phase, knowing full well that I was packing my kit and headed back up to Scotland, up to Arbroath, and devastating time.
How did you bounce back from that? Because I'm guessing the only other major rejection of that size that you'd had in the past was football, and then you filled that gap with the paras. I'm assuming not being able to parachute was disappointing, but not quite the same existential, cursing the universe level of distraught. So what was your emotional reaction, and then how did you get that under control to take action to go again?
Yeah. So bizarrely, when I got back to Arbroath, about a week later, I actually met a lady who became my future wife. And I think, it's true what they say. If you've got a good lady behind you, it can rebuild your confidence and everything else. So I met Kim, who later became my wife, and the mother of my 4 children. And we started a relationship, I suppose. So my intention was to literally go straight back on the summer course and not dwell. Because I think the longer you dwell on summer, it has more of an impact. So for me, it was right. I failed that, so I am now in 4 months' time. I'm going to go back on the summer course, and just crack on. But unfortunately, I met not unfortunately, fortunately, I met Kim, and we started a relationship. So my priority has slightly changed, because I wanted to build a relationship with this woman. The urge to go straight back on selection wasn't there anymore. And so I actually put off going back on selection by 3 years. And in that 3 years, I got married. and Kim actually was expecting our first child, Connor, who was born down in Plymouth. Because what the battery did, because they obviously knew that I was determined to go back on selection, they posted me down to Plymouth to as an instructor on the All Arms Commando course, which was for me a fantastic blessing in disguise, really. And it just gave me a bit more motivation, if that makes sense, to not only to help youngsters getting ready to do the commando course, but also in a sort of selfish way. It got me back up to speed mentally, to give SES selection another crack, if that makes sense. One thing I alluded to, I got told when I left for Paris, I got told you can't parachute. I I sneaked myself on a para course just after the Falklands. The battery was away somewhere, and the clerk obviously didn't know that on my record it was no parachuting. But anyway, he rang me up and said, "Oh, Mick, there's a para course during summer leave. Do you fancy doing it?" And I went, "Absolutely." Just so I went down there to Bryce Norton, did my para course, and then absolutely annoyed everybody when I got back to Arbroath, especially the medical centre, because they then had to remove no parachuting, because obviously when you join the SAS, not parachuting is not even an option. You have to be able to parachute. So that in between bit, and I suppose in a way that sort of it caught me out as being a bit of a rebel. I've always been a bit of a non-conformist, if that makes sense, and that really just compounded it. That yeah, okay, they said you can't do that, but hey, let's give it a bash anyway, and see how we and as it happened, I've done lots and lots of parachute jumps since then, and my ankles never given me any issues at all.
So it was a clerical error that got you through selection, not your own hard work or will or any of that stuff. Just a simple clerical error. That was all it was. I'm kidding, of course. But what a great turn of fate that turned out to be, because I'm sure that would have been a conversation once you got there. So second time round, selection hills obviously went well, but then you were on unknown territory in unknown territory, the jungle. How did you fare there before ultimately passing through into 22 SAS?
Yeah, again. So as I alluded to, Connor was born. Connor was actually about 5 days old when I went on selection. So the next time I saw him, he was 6 months old.
Wow.
Obviously because I had passed selection. But the jungle phase is by far. So I was very lucky on the hill phase this time, purely because I got to the start of test week with no injuries, no tweaks, no. And that's the aim of the game in SAS selection. Get to test week with no injuries. You then give yourself a great chance of actually passing, if that makes sense. So we were flying, and it went really well. So and lucky enough really to pass. And I say lucky because there are a lot of people that fail SAS selection, not because they're idiots or wasters or something like that. It's purely because their bodies give out, and they get injured and stuff like that. Now, these people would make fantastic SAS soldiers without a shadow of doubt, but they've been really unlucky and they get injured. So I always class that bit, that I was lucky enough to get through that bit, and then got to the jungle. Now, unfortunately, with the jungle, it's the hardest part of selection, bar none. Because not only is it physically demanding, it's mentally draining as well. And because of Connor, I had to put everything, Kim, my wife, my newborn son, I had to totally ignore that, because if you don't, and you start thinking about family life, it puts you in a bad place, because the jungle is such an atmosphere, really, and you just need to be focused on getting yourself through selection. And I know that sounds very selfish, in a way, but it's just the way it is. You can't fanny about, really, and start thinking family, while you're preparing to do something in the jungle. And bizarrely, a lad came over to me one afternoon. We just finished, walk through the jungle, a run through the jungle, more like. But he came up to me and started talking, and tried to engage in family conversation. And I had no time for it at all, and said, "Listen, mate, you're talking to the wrong person. No interest." Unbeknown to me, I think this was a bit of a cry for help from him, because he was having second thoughts about whether or not he should stay there. And the next day, he actually handed all his kit in, and he was gone. He decided that it wasn't for him. Now,
Do you think there's anything you could have said to him that would have changed the outcome? Or do you think his mind was made up given the fact he was actually asking the question in the first place?
absolutely, yeah. I think he just wanted to get confirmation from someone else, that it wasn't the be all and end all. But unfortunately, I was the other way. It was, I'm not interested. And in a way, selfishly, I'm glad I actually didn't engage in conversation, because it is very off-putting. Your mind has got to be 100% on the job in hand in the jungle environment, and any distraction above that can be very detrimental to you passing or failing, if that makes sense. And again, it went really well, and unfortunately, we had a fatality in the jungle, and it wasn't one of the guys who was on selection. But we had an accidental shooting of one of the volunteers, military guy who volunteered to come over to Brunei to act as the enemy, and he was unfortunately accidentally shot and killed. So that was a bit of a culture shock, to be honest. That we're in a training environment, and all of a sudden we've got a fatality. But as it transpired, I soon got used to that, because the SAS, without a shadow of doubt, you train for realism, and you have to, if that makes sense. So you're doing everything right on that line of being fairly realistic, because the old adage, train hard, fight easy, comes to mind, if that makes sense. So it certainly wasn't the first and the last fatality that we were going to see in training, but unfortunately that's just the beast that you're in, and what you've volunteered for. But it was a bit of a culture shock, to be carrying a fatality off the training area.
Why don't we rewind a little bit? Why don't you, first of all, for those that might not be aware, lay out the separate stages to the selection process, and then if you just run us through your experience of each of those stages and the sort of key lessons that you learned along the way.
Sure. Yeah, because there's a lot of misconceptions, especially about TV things now.
We're gonna get onto that as well. Don't you worry.
I'm not going to go into that. I'm not here to slag it off or anything, but there's just confusion there because people see a title saying SAS Who Does Wins, and they go candidates selection process. The wording's kind of similar. VW, all this type of shit, right? So there's a lot of similarities within the terminology because obviously you've got ex-special forces guys running it for a TV company. But one of the questions I get asked, or did used to get asked quite a lot, was, is that actually like selection? And the answer has always been, it's nothing like it. Is it?
And for clarity as well, you were asked to be one of the directing staff, weren't you? And this is the very reason that you chose not to do so.
That was more personal reasons within that, which anyone who is watching this who's from the same background will completely understand. But for those who don't, it's more of a kind of, it's almost like you don't want to be the person who sold the soul to the devil.
Okay.
And unfortunately, and I'm not degrading anyone by doing it. People have got their reasons. People have got different, those people have different beliefs than I have on it, and that's up to them. Nothing against them for wanting to do that. Everyone's got to earn money. Everyone has different ambitions, and that can lead to other things. At the end of the day, you've got to put food on the table. You've got to look after yourself and do what you want to do. And it's not all a bad thing. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. It's helped a lot of people, whether it be in the professional world and in the personal space. It's not a bad thing.
Do you think it's been an effective recruitment drive for the military in general?
Nah, I don't. Nah,
No.
and I didn't. And actually, that thought has changed. I at one point, this is before a couple of conversations I had with guys who are still in, recently, in fact, and my stand on it was that, I mean, it's kind of like a free marketing campaign. It's just huge. This program is huge and it's hugely popular, and it's actually for the viewer, for their viewing audience, it's a good program. If it wasn't, they wouldn't have the numbers or the popularity. That's just common sense. So it's like, it's a good program. It's actually, I've watched it a few times, and it's like, I can relate to it in ways, but I'm thinking kind of, some of it's kind of cringe, but at the same time, I'm like, it's not easy. I mean, it's only a short process, but you get people who are like from normal everyday life giving it a go and realizing, holy shit, this isn't actually that easy. And it's a very, very short period of time that they get beasted for. But that's all it is a complete beasting. It's testing their physical and mental resilience over a very condensed period of time, and then emphasized for the camera, right? So, people will say to me, like, is it like selection? And I'll be like, no, because selection is like 6 months long. And there's various phases in that, which are, each one is 4 times as long as that whole thing. So you can't compare. But at the same time, when it comes to the recruitment side of things, I first thought that this was going to be like a free ad campaign for them. And it kind of was, in effect. The problem with that is, it's a bit like you and I doing, running some ads that are completely incongruent with our businesses, and then getting a wave of people who just are bad fits for our program.
Yeah, I know what you mean. They're not going to stay, are they? It's false advertising. If you're sold on the premise and then you sign up to the premise and it's not the same thing, then you're not going to stick it out. And let's be honest, selection isn't something you can just show up and and walk through with. Oh, I'm surprised at the end. This isn't what I expected.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's even more rigid now as to how that actually gets thrashed out and filtered down and funneled into the process.
And even getting into the army in the first place is even more difficult than it was when the show began. From a general recruitment point of view, because it paints that picture. Yeah, but
you got an idea, and pre-selection courses and the rest of it. Now you're very aware of what's to come when you go on that course. That was one of the bigger problems. But anyway, in actual fact, what I think has happened is that you've had a lot of bad fits go, oh, SAS Hooters wins. That's me, right? I'm going to go and do that, and then they turn up and go, holy shit, this is completely different to what I expected. So you're getting people joining the army through watching SAS Who Wins, and then going, I want to be in the SAS or the SBS, whatever they decide to join from whatever faction, and then they get there, and the reality is completely different. So, so it's a yes and no answer. I think it's one of those. It's a bit of a two-sided coin as far as, yes, in some ways, it's got the name out. More people are aware of what the SAS is, but they just don't know what it's about in detail.
Yeah,
the real SAS, if you like,
Yeah, I think it's probably important for me to acknowledge that I'm only talking about these things conceptually and from the conversation I've had with those that have walked the walk and sort of filled me in on the details. So from a personal fascination point of view, it's interesting to compare the psychology of what the public are presented with and your perception now of how it actually could be a positive. But it seems like the overwhelming consideration is it is just entertainment for you at this point.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
But the course, you asked them about the course, right?
Yeah. So just if you want to run us through that 6-month phase in the pre-selection courses that you mentioned just then.
So now what they've got is, which even back when I'm not fully aware of what the process is now, to be honest with you. But back when I did it, over 20 years ago, it was you had to attend a pre-selection course, and I think in actual fact back then, like, the parachute regiment guys didn't have to do this. If I remember right, there was like everyone except paras that were on the course, because I think there was such a high influx of parachute regiment guys. There was so much familiarity and history there that I think it was more evident that it was guys who were from other regiments who maybe weren't so aware or what was to be expected, and to just basically separate the wheat from the chaff. It was a fucking weeding exercise to get rid of the tire kickers that would ultimately turn up just to go and do day one and go, I tried selection. And that usually, but that's all admin, right? So again, it's time, it's money, it's admin. I think what they tried to do is, as a military whole, was to condense that and basically, filter out people who weren't good fits right from the beginning. So there was a pre-selection course that you'd have to apply for. Then you get accepted on that. Then that was like a 3 day. I think now it's 5 days, but I think back then it was like 3 days of solid beastings and tests. That was actually a cheeky little 3 days in itself, and it was pass fail. It wasn't necessarily pass fail. It was just recommended or not recommended. So if you did shit, they'd be like, nah, you're nowhere near, and might never be, or you're close but no cigar. It's go away for a year, come back, or it was you're ready to go now, get on the next course.
Yep.
Which is what happened to me. I actually went on there very fit, very up to date with my military knowledge and all that. I was really prepared for the pre-selection course because I was hyped up for it. So I was like, holy shit, every single part of this is really gonna make a difference. So I prepped myself well for the pre-selection. When I went on the pre-selection, I didn't piss it, but I mean I did very well on it. So I had planned to go 6 months later, and they says, look, we'll see you January. This is November. We'll see you January. And I was like, oh, holy shit, I've got like 7 weeks to prepare for this thing. And I was like, will I be ready? I was like, yeah, you'll be fine. Don't worry. It's a course. You get fitted on the course. Don't worry. Just don't overtrain. That was the biggest thing, actually. Don't overtrain was what the main instruction was.
Which is actually massively ahead of what you'd expect these days, because there's still a pretty negative culture in the army of I need to be doing more than the next guy, otherwise I'm going to fail. And that we've got a lot of clients with Omnia, Johnny and I, that we're there to help calibrate those army lads with bigger ambitions to help keep them robust, but adapting in the right direction rather than just beasting themselves into oblivion. And then when you're on week 2, week 3 of the hills, you fall apart because you've gone into it too fatigued.
I mean, I was completely uneducated in this. I mean, if I'd have known then what you know now, even what I know now, but let's say I knew then what you know now, that could have been a good thing, could have been a bad thing, because it could be too you could become too consumed by the detail, and then
Might give you false confidence as well.
get in your own head, or it could be the best thing ever if you utilize it properly. But all skills and knowledge are only useful if you utilize them in the right way. So back then it was very, very basic, and I think this is something I always go back to, is like keeping the main thing. But back then it was very basic advice I got, really basic, to the point where it was almost like they were saying, don't do much, because I was young and I was fit. The thing is, I had time on my side, and they know for a fact that the course itself, you don't have to be at peak. In fact, you're best not being at peak when you're on day one, week one. Let the course get you fit. Just don't turn up completely unprepared, because you're not going to make it past day one probably. But if you can pass an army combat fitness test, which is an 8-miler with 44 pound in your bag, you can do the rest of the course. If you can pass that and not half die, then you'd be all right for the rest of the course. So the hills phase was like 4 weeks, and you start off as a big group. You do like we used to call it, I think they called it walkabout, where you go out in large groups where you do some navigation techniques. You each get to do a little bit. It's very kind of methodical and monkey see, monkey do type fashion, and then you go into groups of 4 after like the first few days, and then groups of 4 the second week, first half of the second week. Then it's pairs, and then from day 1, week 3, you're on your own. So you kind of do half the hills with someone or more people. Then you do the last 2 weeks by yourself as an individual test. But there's loads of people in the hills. You're individually tested, so you are essentially on your own.
And you're in and out of base, aren't you? But it's you're in and out of base, and the real challenge from it psychologically, and where you sort of separate, for want of a better phrase, the men from the boys, is waking up each morning thinking, I've got to do this again. I've got to do this again. Oh, do I want to do this again? My hips are hurting. What was your experience like with that?
It's like in business, if you have a good week making money, how many weeks can you do that for in a row and keep doing this, having the same performance? Because you'll know, like in business, so people that are watching this that are in the business world, they'll be tuned into the fact that it's the basic things done repeatedly well that really make the difference. not something new and shiny every single day to try. It's consistent basics. That takes patience, that takes grit, it takes determination. And with selection, it was the simple fact of waking up in the morning, knowing what's to come, or worse, knowing you've got to do the shit that made you really painful yesterday. You're going to have to do that again and then some today. And then tomorrow you're going to have to do it again.
And it's stacking day on day on day and day, isn't it?
The weight's only getting heavier, the distances are only getting longer, the terrain's potentially getting worse. And that takes a lot of start and stop mentality of bookending that day and going, right, that's done, it's in the past. Fuck that off. And then worry about the day that you're on, one day at a time. So one of the things is to not overwhelm yourself and think about 2 weeks down the line. Be on week one and think of an endurance march, which is 65Ks, and going, oh my God, we only did like 14Ks today as a group. And I'm kind of, I'm tired. So 65Ks in 3 weeks from now, or 4 weeks from now, how am I going to do? I'm going to be by myself. It's a long distance. It's heavier weight. The fact of the matter is, all you need to do is chunk everything down, a bit like goal setting. So don't think about the big picture all the time and then overwhelm yourself. Just go, today I've got to get up and I've got to make sure I'm prepped to do this. And at the end of that day, I'm going to be done. I'm going to be sleeping. I'm going to be eating. I'm going to be bookending that day. And the next day, just think about that day. And when you're out in the hills, it's one step at a time. It's a bit like, you probably heard people saying, I think David Goggins has even said this type of thing where they go, I only have to get from this point to that point, then I'll think about the next point when I get there.
Yeah.
And it's true. It's a bit like being on a treadmill. You just go, right, however you can psychologically deal with it the best, whatever fits your personality the most. You've probably done a million versions of this almost. Right? So
I'm from an ultra training point of view.
And at a time, or every 2 minutes, you break it down however you want. And that's what I would say is the difference is that just keep getting up, keep showing up every single day, when it's dark, when it's cold, when you're tired, when your feet have got blisters, and going again.
So lads dropping around you like flies, directing staff giving you more and more to take on, fatigue's increasing, pain's increasing, questions about yourself are increasing. How did you deal with those lads dropping around you? What did that do for you psychologically? Did it put a fire up your arse, or did it weigh you down?
Yeah, it's the best thing ever. Yeah, I mean, I don't really understand, and this isn't, wanting people to fail, but at the end of the day, it's a competitive, they have to lose numbers. They can't just take on every single person that attends SAS selection. They can't take on 50% of that. There is essentially a capacity of badged troops at the end. So if they have 250 people going the hills, and miraculously all those people are just getting through it, they don't have the capacity to take 250 people to the jungle, logistically or otherwise. So they have to lose people, right? And as history would prove, that it's always happened. That's just been the pattern. But when people start to drop around you, it's, when you're part of a large group of 250 people day one going, oh my God, am I out of my depth? Psyching yourself out and getting in your own head, and then all of a sudden you're still there when there's 100 people there. That tells yourself that, well, if I'm in the 100 that's still here and there's 150 people not here, something I've been doing is more than what they did. So the narrower that channel is in, and the less the numbers become, you gain energy from that, because you're still in the mix, you're still in the fight, and that can only ever be a good thing. So psychologically, it's actually a really good thing for the mind, and I alluded to that on the Human 24 podcast as well when it was on it, about the one day that I really remember when I was having the shittest day ever, and someone who I perceivably thought was way more advanced and more experienced and bigger and stronger than I was,
The SAS said,
just basically wrapped his tits in front of me, right in front of me, and I was like, and suddenly it was just like, it was like a rocket up your ass, because that wasn't in my mind. I wasn't contemplating that. So I'm going, well, I must be mentally stronger than he is, because he's just done something that I've not even contemplated.
For clarity,
So
wrapping his tits meaning pulling out voluntary withdrawal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, and voluntary withdrawal is like something that is completely an individual thing. People have got the reasons, and I think when people do that, again, it's not, you put a bigger consequence in the fact that, would he have done it if someone held a gun to his kid's head? then likely not. But you either want it or you don't want it.
Yeah.
And the more it means to you, then the more reason you have to keep going.
So it's almost the flip side of what you were saying before, whereby once you're in that environment, once you're in that group, and you've got over the lack of familiarity that you had in the Fusiliers that other troops had,
Yeah.
it then flipped. So rather than being a deterrent for getting involved, it became further faith in yourself rather than a lack of faith
Yeah.
in yourself.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think if we're to take that and apply it from a non-selection point of view for those listening, because I'm a huge fan of, obviously, I mean, it's conventional these days. People like taking lessons from adversity of others, and I think that the main thing is that you carve your own path and play your own game. And the longer you do that, and the more you feed off those around you, take the lessons from those around you, don't let other people's failures, successes guide you too differently from the path you're already on, you will come out on top. As long as you abandon the ego, acknowledge where you're weak, where you need to work, and
Yeah.
take the necessary actions to move forwards, that's where we can all pass through our own selection, to use a pretty wanky metaphor. But
No, absolutely, mate.
yeah, if there's adversity that we need to fight through, then we can take a lot of lessons from what you just said there. So
Yeah.
Hills phase, you passed out. How many lads didn't pass? So how many of you were left throughout your Hills phase?
And I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, between 250 and 280 day one. And I'm sure we went to the jungle with like 58. I don't know how I remember these numbers, but they just stick in my mind. I think we went to the jungle with 58 students. So that was obviously a couple of hundred-ish.
Was it in Borneo then for you as well?
It was at Brunei.
Brunei, sorry, yeah, Brunei, yeah.
Yeah, Brunei. Yeah, so you're talking that, percentage-wise, I'm not sure, but a couple of hundred and maybe a few more didn't pass the hills phase, and that's a mixture of PW injury, that obviously results in medical withdrawal, or voluntary withdrawal, or not making the times, simply failing the marches and not making the times. So it's a combination of all three, really.
And the premise of the jungle is basically to take those remaining 58, in your case, or the remaining quota of any case, of any course, and put them through humidity, discomfort, out your comfort zone. You don't have a base, you're out in the wilderness, and you've got to deal with the challenges that presents. Dehydration is a huge one. We've had a few guys come on to us that have had to VW or been taken off because of hydration issues. So it's then managing that, but it's basically 6 weeks of completely non-trainable in the UK discomfort to see who's got what's left. So
It's one of those.
talk us through it.
It's one of those. It's an environment that it's very It's a very testing environment in many ways, and it definitely separates the boys from the men. There are people who pass the hills and they jack on day one in the jungle because they throw you into it, and it's like I was saying before, when that group becomes a more focused group and there's less people, then becomes more detail, right? So you've got the same amount of staff looking after a lot less people, so there's more eyes on you and they get to know you at that point. So now they're looking for not just if you can get from A to B with a burger on your back in a certain time, however you get there. You're not judging how you get there. You can go any way you want. If you turn up at the checkpoint, you've passed. However, when you go to the jungle, they're starting to look at your soldiering ability, because at the end of the day, you need to be a soldier. That's at the top of the priorities for them, is that can you operate in the way that they need you to operate on operations. That's the long and the short of it. And there are just some people who aren't cut out for it, or just don't like it, and that's just the bottom line. And some people that are great at it and love it. So when you've got a lot less people, and then you've got 4 or 5 man patrols with a DS, and then you're starting to have to develop or demonstrate new skill. And it's not just demonstrating it like you would in the infantry. You're talking like granular level details that you just cannot get away with. The simplest of things. And it is essentially applying some really basic soldiering skills very, very well. And that's really what they're looking for at that point, because they're still not looking for the finished article. They're looking at someone who's got the aptitude, mentally and physically, to learn and develop those skills further on. Because obviously, life in that regiment, you have to be developing new skills all the time, because technology is changing, tactics are changing. There's a lot of things that are always evolving, so you have to adapt to that. And I think the adaptation of what you have to do is one of the most important things. So there are some people who I saw who were very set in their ways, good at what they did, but they just couldn't assimilate new skills as well as someone else. They were just too. It was too ingrained within them to operate a certain way, and sometimes that came from the more experienced guys actually.
That's a really applicable lesson to each and every one of us, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah,
good funny example. When I used to work in the pub trade for Heineken in London, and this was sort of 2017, 2018, when there was all the stuff around duty going up and good pubs are being shafted by the government, etc., etc. But whenever I had that conversation with publicans or landlords, whatever you want to call them, the ones that were saying, I've been doing it for this way for years, I know what I'm doing. You shouldn't tell me what I should be doing to my bar in terms of upgrading products, etc., for higher priced, better beers. They were the ones that went out of business the following year, but they were
yeah,
blaming others because they'd been doing it their way for so long. So there's a real world example, an interesting one. I didn't expect to be talking about that at any point soon, but that's exactly the same thing, isn't it? It's you separated those that were adaptable and those that weren't,
yeah,
and the whole reason I suffered from depression in the first place was because I was so stuck in my ways that when I was forced to adapt or staying the same was the wrong decision.
yeah.
So now I'm highly adaptable in every sort of
Mhm.
facet of my life, and I'm much happier, much more successful, and much more malleable to the situation that I'm in than I was before. So it's
Yeah.
fascinating to hear that that was something that you dealt with in the jungle under those conditions. So you passed out. You were one of, you might remember the number, you might not, but it seems there's a number stuck in your head. How many of you passed out at the end?
So from the end of the jungle, you get very few will fail.
Yeah,
It's almost like they always remember like the day that we, because you get told when you come back to Hereford if you've passed or not.
that must be a long flight.
You've got, you've got yeah, yeah. You just take the words out of my mouth there. It was one of those real nerve-wracking experiences because, especially like, because what happens, the DS all get around the table and they go through every single person, because all the DS get to know every single individual. And maybe one DS that thinks you're a good guy and one guy who thinks you're not such a good guy. So it's a bit of a Chinese parliament as far as how they, you know, deliberate on who's going to pass, who's going to fail. So I think from, and there's a lot of people VW in the jungle, by the way. There's a lot of VWs because of the fact that it's just such a humid, testing, very claustrophobic environment because you're under the canopy of the trees. You're not like out in the sun. You really don't really see a lot of sky the whole time you're in there. It's just under this thick canopy of trees the whole time, and it's like 4 weeks. So you got like the live firing phase, which is really testing as well. Is actually quite a nerve-wracking experience because of the fact that it's live firing, it's very close proximity, and you're just scrutinised for every single detail of every single skill that you're applying. So that there's a lot of anxiety with that phase, I would say. I always remember that. Just like get real fucking jitters before going on a range. You're scared. You're just like it's not so scared of being shot. You're just because you're so close to everyone, but you're just scared of getting something wrong. So so that's a really testing part. And then in the actual jungle itself, because you got build up training as well. So you get 2 weeks build up training. You got range package. Then you got 4 weeks in the jungle. So I think the whole jungle phase is like 8 weeks. And within that 4 week test phase of the when you're in the jungle, that's the real tough part. And people either, like I say, people either adapt to it or they don't. I'd never been in the jungle before, so it was a new thing for me. But I think that was good because I actually enjoyed it. It was frustrating and it was hard, but I always knew that no matter what I do with this course, if all I need to do is get to the end and try my best, I will have learned a hell of a lot that's going to benefit me anyway, right? Although I was trying to pass. So at the end of that phase, you then don't get told until you're back in Hereford whether you've passed or not. And I always remember like being back in the cinema room at the training squadron block in the camp, and then it's a bit like when they do an X Factor when they've got like the two rooms of people. It was like that. So we're all sat in the one room. So alphabetically, the nominal roles called out, and being Bruce, mine was always towards the beginning. And I don't need to worry about these people because I'm probably never going to see them again. But the people who failed, you kind of had a rough idea because they'd probably been pulled aside at some point in the jungle to say, look, this final exercise, this is like your moment. This is going to make or break you. You need to either step it up or you're going to be failing, right? So I hadn't had that chat. I hadn't had a conversation like that, so I hadn't ever been pulled aside. So I was fairly confident, but you just don't know. And I genuinely didn't have a clue. I thought maybe they're going to say I'm too young or whatever. So I got to the end and we're sat there. and the training officer comes in. He says, right, the following names. No, it was the chief instructor comes in, and he says the following names go and see the training officer. So the training officer's in charge of the course. The chief instructor's like the head DS. He says go and see the training officer. Following names. So I'm thinking alphabetically, is it going to be read out that way? So I can kind of be sure. And then all I need to do is think about the names that have been called out, because you know everyone in the course. You're thinking, right,
Yeah.
good guy, you know, one of those ones. So they started calling the names out, and it got past B, and then the next name that got called out was like wanker. So then, and the remaining, the whole list basically, it was all the dodgy, like, maybe nots, and some definitely nots. There was some guys that were like, had got to the end and just weren't ever going to get in. So I heard this list being called out. I thought, my name's not on it alphabetically, so pretty safe. But then they got sent out and had to go and see the train officer, and it was about half. It was like 50% of that. So I think, and then obviously people had jacked in the jungle. So I think there was something like 18, but 18 at the end. SAS and SBS combined.
And those left in the room got the thumbs up.
12, I think 12 guys that went to the regiment that year, yeah, and then like 6 or something went to the SBS. So so a small number, but as soon as those guys left, and I'm looking around me, seeing all the top blokes in the course around me, I'm thinking, yeah, I'm pretty confident. And then he says, right, so the train officer, you still don't get told. No one says anything. And all of a sudden the train officer comes in at the end after telling them obviously they're off the course, and then going, right, you guys are what we term as the hardcore element of this course. So from that, I think we lost about maybe 3 more before the end of selection. It was that, and bear in mind that was like half the course at that point. You've still got 3 months, but when you think about how that's chopped up, you go 4 weeks hills, 8 weeks jungle. That's 3 months of 2 very important parts, and then you've got the remaining part, which is only one essential part after that. Really, they're all essential, but there's only one real testing part, which is combat and survival and escape and evasion, which is, if you're going to lose anyone, it's probably going to be there. And we lost 1 guy on that, I think, and then lost a couple more. I can't remember how, but in the last 4 weeks is the parachute course. So like, there's like 2 week phases. From that point on, you're doing something different every 2 weeks. So like hills, jungle, you do like observation posts, you do communications signals, you do the parachute course, and yeah, I think that's about it. Yeah, and then that's you.
By the age of 21, I was now a para commando, a diver, and a PTI. I'd done every arduous course that you could do within the Royal Engineers, and I then in the military I saw a lot of guys I worked with going off to special forces, to the SAS at that point, because you could only go to the SAS if you're from the army. I then became an instructor on the All Arms Commando course, went on, became the senior diving instructor at the dive school, spent 8 years in commando reconnaissance troops. So for me, there was a natural pull towards the Royal Marines. I had the Green Beret, I loved the water and things like that. And then, so when I decided to do selection, thankfully, the SBS had opened up that you could do tri-service. You didn't have to come from the Royal Marines, which is primarily what they were doing up until that point. So they were starting to look for guys from the army. And the reason for that was Marines had the option of going SAS or SBS. But if they didn't like diving, or they had a head injury through rugby and they couldn't dive, they could go SAS. So the SBS were losing a lot of their candidates to the SAS. So they then looked wider beyond the Marines to the Army. And so, yeah, that's what I did. And much to the disgust of my friends in the SAS, I applied for the Special Boat Service and became one of the first Army candidates to pass selection for the SBS, and sort of change that mould.
What was the key driver for the Special Forces selection? Just it was the logical next step in your career, or was there something a bit more innate in you that wanted to keep pushing and pushing?
I think it was a bit of both. Like I said, as a youngster, I didn't really know much about the military. My father was what we would call a tracksuit soldier, so he was very good at sport. He was the Army football manager, coach, and player. So he spent majority of his time actually in the tracksuit or wearing football boots and running the football team. So that's all I really saw in my father's career was what we would see on the football pitches. So I didn't really understand the concept of the military, what units did what, who supported what units. I didn't realise that 5-9 Commandos supported the Royal Marines and 9 Para supported the Air, but I wasn't aware about that whole sort of infrastructure. It was only when I joined the military I then become aware of the military as a whole, saw it as a bigger picture. But yes, when you've done the commando courses and things like that, and you're working in the recce troops and you see all these guys going on to selection, you sort of, again, as I mentioned, I was more confident in my own abilities. I just thought, well, why not? It wasn't something I always wanted to do. And I think I don't know whether I was mentally at an advantage. There was a lot of guys that I went on selection with, all they've ever wanted to do from a young boy age, 5 or 6 or even older, was be in the Marines or be in the Paras and be in the SES or SBS. And that's all they'd focus on. And their whole lives have been geared towards that one course. Whereas for me, it hadn't. I sort of stumbled across it by accident. But for me, I didn't put myself under that self-induced pressure. And there was a lot of guys, unfortunately, either injuries or just didn't make the grade, who didn't pass, and still they leave the military. Their dreams are broken. So for me, it was just the next stage. It's just the next stage. But I didn't put myself under that extreme self-induced pressure.
Was it everything you wanted to be once you got going? Because once you get to the SBS, there's only internal rungs to climb, aren't there? In terms of rank, there's nowhere else to go.
Yeah, there is. Going back slightly, when I was in the recce troops and things like that, you're working along, like-minded individuals, and then you sort of then start shining amongst them and poking out. But then when you go to special forces, you then realise, especially on the selection process at the end, that you are working with like-minded individuals, self-driven, who just want to achieve the best they can be. So I knew now I was in the right group of people that I wanted to be with. But yeah, you've touched on rank. I did selection as a sergeant, so you lose that completely. You go back to trooper. So I sort of give it, everything I'd done in the Royal Engineers, back to trooper and start again. But for me, that I had no issues with that. I know some people weren't comfortable with that, because they'd achieved quite a lot in their previous careers, and to have to then start all over again. But for me, no, I welcome that.
It sounds like it goes back to the point you made earlier, whereby if you'd had 15, 20 years to sit on it thinking this is what I'm meant to be, this is what I'm going to do, then ego would very quickly take over. Whereas if it was just logical career progression, this is where I've found my people, my like-minded, self-driven individuals, then you could almost say you found your home in that group, rather than wanting to keep pushing and pushing and pushing.
Yeah, no, that's it. Yeah, I had found my home, and these guys, and it is, as I know you've interviewed a couple of guys before, and it's like, these guys don't need to tell them twice. They just go do it, and they try and do it to the best of their abilities. My only sort of regret is I didn't go for selection earlier. When I finally got there, I was like, why was I not aware of this any earlier? But I actually think, there's a flip side to that. Would I have been ready at that point? Was I mature enough? Did I have the experience enough to pass selection then or not? So, it's that whole, hindsight's a great thing.
What were the biggest lessons you learned about yourself from an internal point of view during selection itself?
Internal ones. For me, it was, what were my internal ones? I knew I was capable. I knew I was capable and things like that. But how far you can push your body, that was a key one for me. I'd pushed it on other courses, but not to the extent I had on selection. So that was one for me. But also having confidence. I was quite confident when I went on the course, and they play mind games with you as well. Like, you're not good enough and things like that. But just believe in your own abilities Just believe in your own ability, ignore the white noise, and just go for it. So I enjoyed those sort of mind games that they were trying to play as well, because you don't really get that on other courses. Other courses in the military, and I've been there as an instructor, you motivate the students. You give them sort of words of motivation and let them know when they've done well. Well, you don't get that at all on selection. You don't get any sort of indication of how you're doing. So you have to be sort of confident in your own abilities that you are doing well. And so yeah, that was interesting for me, because that's the first time I had real sort of mind games played on me.
The interesting thing Gaz said when we last spoke on here, actually, and we've spoken sort of off camera, and I think he had a very lengthy whiskey-fueled discussion with my business partner and coach Johnny recently about exactly this, was how nobody turns up to selection as the finished article, as the product that's there ready to go. It's who's got the foundations necessary to be developed within the course to then become what the course is there to create you into.
Yeah. No, I agree completely with that. Yeah, it's not the finished article. It just gives you, everyone comes from different backgrounds, whether you're Royal Engineers, whether you're Marines, whether you're a chef. And so you all bring something unique to the party as well. You've all got your own sort of experiences. And yeah, it sort of carves you into almost like a little shape like that. And then when you pass selection, they'll then mold you into the finished product over the years. It doesn't happen within that 6 months. They just need to know that you've got the right attributes, the right mentality and physical attributes to go through that process.